Okay, in this video I'm going to look at the benefits and costs to the UK of an increased globalised world. The first benefit to the UK is there'll be a much wider choice of goods and services for consumers because we'll be importing many more goods from overseas. Secondly, there'll be much lower prices for consumers. This is because many of these goods will have been produced in low-cost countries where labour costs are much lower. This obviously keeps inflation down, and this is certainly what happened in the 1990s and the start of this century. Cost-push inflation was particularly low for this reason. Think about the benefits for consumers there. Secondly, there's a much wider market for British firms to sell their goods into. This has certainly helped a lot of British multinationals such as BT. What happens there, if they can sell into a wider market, that clearly their output's going to go up, and so they're going to achieve greater economies of scale, and therefore the cost per unit will fall, and therefore they can compete better. Notice the chain of reasoning there. Whether they actually pass that on in the form of cheaper prices, we know that always depends. Good example there is Jaguar Land Rover, who has seen a huge growth in their sales, especially to countries like China. And there's a video on Jaguar Land Rover later on in this video. Third thing to consider is there's much greater competition between firms because of the ability for firms to produce and sell in many different markets. The UK has seen much greater competition in certain areas. Of course, if there's greater competition, that puts pressure on firms to increase efficiency and in many cases to lower prices. We've certainly seen that there when we think about the grocery market and the growth of Aldi and Lidl, forcing the likes of Asda and Tesco to reduce prices, and also we see it in the insurance market. So there's lots of good examples there to show how greater competition actually benefits us, the consumer. And the fourth benefit is increased FDI. Remember, FDI stands for Foreign Direct Investment. That's when an overseas company invests into the UK. Whenever you think of FDI, you should always be thinking about the multiplier as well. An initial injection into the economy leads to a greater increase in national income. Of course, there's some classic examples in the UK, such as Toyota and Nissan. And of course, them investing in the UK, in their factories producing cars, has created jobs, and as a result we've seen an increase in growth. On the downside though, of course, we've seen many firms relocate their production overseas, and that is obviously a cost to the UK, and that is what I'll consider next. Okay, so building from the final benefit, globalisation has certainly meant a decline in manufacturing in the UK. We've seen what's known as a period of deindustrialisation. Make sure you look up that definition. There's a list of definitions at the end of this video which you should make sure you're familiar with. This declining manufacturing, of course, when we think about that, is all about structural unemployment. And certainly, here's your evaluation, this has had a particularly harmful effect in certain parts of the UK. This is happening, of course, because as we've got a more globalised world, businesses are relocating their production overseas to countries where there's much lower costs of labour. Secondly, we should consider the impact on the balance of payments for the UK. This has obviously worsened because in a more globalised world it's much easier to import goods and services, so we've seen a huge increase in imports, and this hasn't been matched by the increase in exports. So in other words, the leakages, remember imports and leakages, have increased at a faster rate than injections in the form of exports. So the balance of payments has got a lot worse. And we'll do a whole lot on the balance of payments a little later in the module and see why that's an issue. The third main cost to the UK is the idea of interdependence. We've come across that before in Unit 3, but this applies to when we think about external shocks. Because we're a more globalised world and we're much more integrated and linked to other economies, when something bad an external shock happens in another economy, that has a big impact on the UK economy. I suppose the classic example in recent years was 2007-2008 with the subprime mortgages, and the credit crunch in the US had a huge impact on the UK and the rest of Europe and led to our recession, which we're only just sort of pulling out of now. So those external economic shocks have a much bigger impact when you're in a much more global economy. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, here's a video link to Land Rover. It's only about 2 minutes long, well worth watching, just to show how Land Rover, a UK-based firm, even though of course it's owned by Tata, an Indian conglomerate, it just shows how Land Rover have benefited from a more global economy. So that's worth watching. Remember, you'll find lots of other examples if you go to the Scoop It page, and there's a whole section on globalisation. Please look at that on a regular basis. I'm always updating it, and there's lots of good examples, and you should be reading one of those articles on a daily basis. Finally, just so we can summarise here, there's some key terms which you should check and add to your definition sheets. I'm sure you've all got definition sheets up and running. That's deindustrialisation, structural unemployment, FDI and economic shocks. We will be revisiting some of those later on in the module, but get ahead now, get some nice solid definitions, and of course ask in class if you're still not clear. I hope that's useful, and I hope you now know about the main costs and benefits of globalisation to the UK.